Nehemiah. How do we read Nehemiah? The captive who is defeated becomes a cupbearer for the great king who takes over the world. But his heart, even though he is personally somewhat sheltered, his heart was aching for his people and for his God. The big question from human perspective that this narrative asks is, should captive people of Israel look for favor before the king and in the face of a bully ruler? Should they look for anything good coming out of this? Of course, he is granted permission to leave his master, and with his master's sealed letter of recommendation, he sets off for his homeland to restore worship of God, of the God of heaven, and to stir his people to trust in God, in his promises and in his power. And he takes other people with him. There are two passages that I want to visit as we look at this book. The first one is Nehemiah 2:17 and 18. Nehemiah tells his people, "Now I said to them, you know very well what trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Let us rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and end this disgrace." Then I told them, he says, about how the gracious hand of God has been on me and about my conversations with the king. They replied at once, "Yes, let's rebuild the wall." So they began the good work. So it all starts with Nehemiah's personal testimony. He personally testifies to God. There's another passage that we should look at, and that's Nehemiah 4:1 and 2. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry, and he was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble or captive Jews doing? Will they restore the wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burnt as they are?" So this passage just highlights the amount of opposition and ridicule. And if the question from human perspective was, should captive Israel look for favor from God before the king and in the face of bully rulers who were harsh and dismissive of Israel, then the question from God's perspective is, do you know that you have a God and that you have more than tradition? If you do, how are you to live your life in the face of so much opposition? So in the light of their opposition, Israel recognized the extreme challenge. And they resorted to, number one, Nehemiah resorted to prayer. Then he retold God's story. He took his people back to Scripture, to God's promises, and he told his personal experiences of God. And then they got to work, committed themselves to working hard, to do the work, the practical work that was required. But they also committed themselves to keeping one another safe. They knew they had a God. They knew that God was more than a tradition, more than a Star of David. They had the sovereign Lord and his promises on their side. And therefore, on the completion of this mammoth task, God's people resorted to celebrating, to eulogize their God, to speak of his immense goodness. They retold the stories, and they again announced that God is much more than a religion, that he is faithful, that he is merciful, that he is dependable, that he is gracious, and nothing changed.